Hello, learners, and welcome to another lecture in this NPTEL course on Victorian literature. We will move forward in our discussion of texts, and in this module, we will discuss Christina Rossetti's narrative poem, Goblin Market. Before I actually get to the poem, however, I would like to contextualize the writer and the text. And to do so, I will discuss some of the developments in religion, especially the movements towards a conservative form of Christianity in Victorian England. This background will be relevant not only for a better understanding and appreciation of Christina Rossetti's Goblin Market, but it will also help us better situate another key text in this course, and that is The Mill on the Floss by George Eliot. Let us begin this contextual introduction with a few lines from a poem by Christina Rossetti. The lines are from a volume titled Sing Song, a nursery rhyme book authored by Christina Rossetti and published in the year 1872. Rossetti writes in this poem, which ostensibly is a book of rhymes intended for children. The poet writes, "Who has seen the wind? Neither I nor you. But when the leaves hang trembling, the wind is passing through. Who has seen the wind? Neither you nor I. But when the trees bow down their heads, the wind is passing by." Now, let us think a little bit about the kind of intellectual and emotional labor that these lines enable us and invite us to practice. The key theme that these lines convey is the perception of something invisible through an observation of that which is visible. One can get this understanding by noticing the literal meaning of the words and the question that the poet asks. Who has seen the wind? Neither I nor you. And then instead of referring to the wind, the poet describes how the leaves tremble and how the trees bow down their heads. So by observing the trees and the leaves, the poet perceives the presence of the wind. So much for the dynamic of the visible and the invisible, and the observation of a difference between observation and perception. More than that, however, more than the registering of a perception, these words also inculcate different attitude. In addition to observing how the presence of the wind can be felt in the tree, these lines also encourage a reverential attitude towards that which we cannot observe, but whose influence we can perceive. These lines take us from observation to perception, and from perception to a reverence, and from a reverence to finally a kind of devotion. These lines do not merely juxtapose facts. These lines do not merely explain how the wind makes the trees and the leaves move. In addition to juxtaposing these facts, that is, the trembling of the leaves, the bowing down of the trees, these words to what science can observe. This is an observation of the natural world, which a lot of natural science and scientists, most famously Charles Darwin, had been engaging in. Minute observation, the detection of patterns in the natural world, and from these patterns, theory of evolution. This was done by scientists of the time. These words begin with a similar process of observation. However, the act of observation ends up producing not simply a theory of evolution or a scientific analogy, but rather it produces a different kind of attitude towards the world, an attitude that is beyond science, more powerful and explanatory than science, and which is like a devotion. Why am I saying that? Because the wind which this poet is trying to observe and locate is equated with spirit in most Christian documents. Therefore, these words about, or this nursery rhyme about who has seen the wind, about the so called invisibility of the wind, is actually about perceiving the power of an invisible force on the world which can be observed. And ultimately, these lines affirm the controlling power of an invisible force. And finally, they emphasize that the natural world, which is visible to us, is under the controlling power of an invisible force. Now, in addition to this, there's also a sense that science can only describe facts. The feeling of submission, however, that cannot be described by science, and for that we need poetry. This is a poem that makes sense of a feeling, the feeling of being powerless, the feeling of perceiving a mighty and divine power. This power is both capable and loving, and the key takeaway of these lines is a trembling anticipation of multiple meanings that are never spelt out in their entirety, but whose presence cannot be denied. What are these multiple meanings? The meanings refer to the different ways in which one can interpret what makes the leaves tremble and the trees bow down their heads. Is it simply the wind? Is it simply a force? Or does this act of trembling and trees bowing down their heads, do these things signify a powerful force and the feeling of submission, the happiness that human beings and other natural beings derive from submitting to a higher power? So it is possible that in the act of observing how the wind moves the trees and the leaves, one can discern a religious and spiritual attitude towards the universe. So this is the range of reference that this apparently very simple sounding and looking poem can convey. Now, let us step back a little bit and take in a wider picture. This poem and the kind of themes it touches on describes in a nutshell the key challenge that readers of Christina Rossetti face. The challenge is how to reconcile these two discordant notes. On one hand, there is a heavy-handed allegorical tone, which suggests that everything we can observe of our natural world is actually being controlled by God or a divine authority. This is the heavy-handed allegorical tone. On the other hand, or in addition to this and somewhat different from this, there is another tone which is not necessarily religious, but not quite secular, impulse to tell stories. There is an impulse to describe and observe things. This sense takes a delight in simple, basic human experiences, like the delight one feels in watching the leaves tremble, watching the trees bow down their heads, moved simply by the wind. The question is how to read the presence of the religious as something that opens literature to wider interpretations instead of imposing narrow or singular interpretations on it. It is threatened, many readers feel threatened that the delight in observing and describing the natural world that one can see in many poems by Christina Rossetti, this delight is closed down or reduced in some ways by the religious allegorical tone, which is also present in the same poems. So how to reconcile these two somewhat contradictory, somewhat opposing tones in the work of a single writer? That is the question, and we will see this tussle or this debate crystallized in the poem Goblin Market, which we will subsequently read. Now, let us think a little bit about the life and career of the writer, Christina Rossetti. Christina Rossetti was born Christina Georgiana Rossetti in the year 1830 and passed away in the year 1894. From the 1860s onwards, she had begun to rise in fame. Her prestige and respect had grown a great deal, and by the time of her death, she was widely regarded as one of the few poets with national acclaim. The success and this widespread fame that Christina Rossetti enjoyed came from two sources. The first was obviously the individual writer's own talent, and she was quite a remarkable and precocious talent. She was writing from a very early childhood, and almost everything she wrote, even as a young writer, had the merit and the accomplishment of serious professional writing. That is one source of the fame and success that Christina Rossetti, who I will also refer to as CGR at subsequent points, enjoyed. That is the first reason. The second reason is the social history of Christianity in 19th century England. There were a lot of public debates on religion, and these debates are extremely relevant to the kind of writing, the tone, and the kind of stories that Christina Rossetti told in her prose and poetry. There is a sense among some scholarly communities that the public debates on religion, the only explanatory frame in which Christina Rossetti's writing can be read. This is a bit of an overstatement because these debates on religion and Christianity, while relevant, do not tell the full story. They are extremely relevant to Christina Rossetti's writing, but there are other themes and other questions as well, and it is the integration of multiple intellectual frames as well as social questions, along with other textual references that make every poem special. And we will see this integration of social, intertextual, as well as other intellectual frames in Goblin Market very shortly. I mentioned that Christina Rossetti was a precocious and talented writer. This is evident from her writing, which she had been producing from a very early stage. She began entering poems into her notebooks in the year 1842, which you can calculate means at the age of 12. One of her earliest notebooks is titled Poems by C.G. Rossetti. This also contains a little preface written by her mother, which reads, N.B. These verses are truly and literally by my little daughter, who scrupulously rejected all assistance in her rhyming efforts, under the impression that in that case they would not be really her own. The first was written when she was 11. Right? This is the note. So we can guess that Christina Rossetti came from a family of writers, a family who respected the young girl's writerly ambitions, and the family who encouraged, through these acts, the future development and growth of this writer. The first publication, although not technically public, but the first printing of the poems of Christina Rossetti took place in the year 1847 when her grandfather privately printed a notebook of verses that she had written. This volume was dedicated to her mother. Now, the other factor which I mentioned, which was responsible for the fame, prestige, and respect that Christina Rossetti gained, was the social debates and the public life of Christianity in Victorian England. To understand this development, we have to think about two movements known as the Oxford movement and the Tractarian movement. These movements began in the 1830s and were a somewhat conservative trend in the church of the time. Now, the Oxford movement began when a few individuals, notably Cardinal John Henry Newman and two others, John Keble and John Froude, believed and came together in their belief that the Anglican Church had gone astray from its founding principles and needed to be reformed. To be clear, the Anglican Church is a Protestant church. It was set up in the 17th century following the Protestant Reformation in Europe. The Anglican Church gave up and rejected many of the rituals, performances, and practices of the Catholic Church because it was seen as giving rise to corruption and taking the devotees away from true faith. That said, in the 19th century, there was a sense that even despite its so-called Protestant leanings and origins, the Anglican Church had begun to go astray. And the way to fix that was to inculcate some Catholic practices. The idea was to make faith visible, and it could be done by reintroducing some rituals, practices, etc., in the Anglican Church. So the individuals who supported that first were Cardinal John Henry Newman, John Keble, and John Froude. These were later joined by Edward Pusey, and for the next 8 years, these scholars published a series of documents known as Tracts for the Times. And this explains why this movement was also known as the Tractarian movement. Now, essentially, they argued that given the kind of times that the Victorian England was seeing, the kind of social developments that were taking place in Victorian England, it was necessary to make some changes. It was necessary to have visible demonstration of the divine powers of religion. And what about the times necessitated such demonstration? Chiefly, it was industrialization and the increasing authority and power of the natural sciences. The sciences had begun to grow in authority. They had begun to win social acclaim. They had begun to convert many people into thinking that the sciences offered a truthful and valuable and meaningful frame in which to understand the contemporary world. In 1845, Newman converted to Catholicism, and these debates intensified. While this debate was taking place, the position which can be broadly understood as a return to religion in the face of science, there was also another movement which was known as the Broad Church movement. In this movement, scholars and clergymen came together who believed that Christianity and religion could have a scientific, historical basis. They essentially questioned the non-scientific basis in the way Christianity was practiced hitherto and wanted to introduce some scientific and historical changes. Between these two, the position of the non-partisan believer was one of confusion. Science versus religion is probably the most important and most famous debate of the Victorian times, and it was a debate that would energize the middle of the Victorian century. The most famous scientist in this intellectual churn was Charles Darwin, whose key work is The Origin of the Species, which was published in the year 1859. This debate, however, began much earlier, and one publication which can be said to have inaugurated this intellectual churn was that of the book The Principles of Geology, published by Charles Lyell in the year 1833. This publication anticipated the controversy which would emerge in 1859 with the publication of Darwin's The Origin of Species. Lyell's book inspired many readers, including Alfred Lord Tennyson, to think of evolution as a serious challenge to the biblical story of creation. Essentially, the religious claim that man was a complex, wonderful, sophisticated, unprecedented being that was created by a divine maker, that only a divine mind could possibly create a being as complex as the human being. Right? This was a religious idea which had begun to be challenged with the publication of Darwin's The Origin of Species, because Darwin's idea was that evolution moves from simpler to complex beings, and a complex being like the human being must have emerged from simpler beings. And this led to a lot of disagreement, a lot of confusion, and writers and poets tried to make sense of that confusion. In addition to Darwin and Lyell, there were many other lesser known, less famous, but equally influential scientists who gained respect in this time. These scientists began teaching courses at Oxford and Cambridge, And in the year 1848, Cambridge introduced honors schools in natural science, followed 4 years later by the same development, that is, honors school in natural science at Oxford University. These were unprecedented changes. Science was not a discipline that was taught at these universities. The fact that science was sanctioned and taught and attracted both pupils and teachers meant that society as a whole was learning to respect this mode of thinking, this style of inquiry, which essentially meant observing the natural world, identifying patterns, and making predictions about the world around one. A logical perspective on the natural world. Now, while scientists and religious scholars were debating matters of faith and doubt, poets also tried to make sense of this confusion. One of the earliest expressions of this attempt to make sense of this confusion between faith and doubt can be found in the work of the poet Clough, Arnold, and Tennyson. A.H. Clough, a poet who I have cited earlier, wrote in his poem The New Sinai in the year 1844. Here is Clough. Lo, here is God, and there is God. Believe it not, O man, in such vain sort to this and that. The ancient heathen ran, though old religion shake her head and say in bitter grief, the day, behold, at first foretold, of atheist unbelief. Take better part with manly heart, thine adult spirit can. Receive it not, believe it not, believe it not, O man. These words very clearly describe how difficult it becomes to hold on to religious faith, given that there are so many scientific, practical, natural justifications for how things happen in the world. Essentially, religion requires human beings to suspend their ability to think practically, to simply believe that things happen because of the reason a religious text or a scholar of religious texts or a clergyman says it is so, as against believing what someone says. Science teaches individuals, readers, and thinkers to ask questions, not simply believe what someone says, but to ask how things happen. How and why does one thing lead to another thing? Once these how questions begin to be asked, the poet of the New Sinai writes, it is difficult to hold on to belief. In another poem, Clough writes again, this is a poem titled Easter Day, Naples, 1849. My heart was hot within me, till at last my brain was lightened, when my tongue had said, Christ is not risen, Christ is not risen, no. He lies and moulders low. Again, this idea that a human being could die and gain godhood or a sort of divine status and then be resurrected from that death-like state, become alive again. This flies in the face of the most basic scientific, biological, and medical knowledge. And yet, many Christians continue to believe in it. A poet like Clough writes a poem on Easter Day about this very resurrection. And you can experience how deep must be the anxiety, doubt, and essentially how confused and how much at pains the writer of these words must be to question such a fundamental matter of religious faith, to write these words, Christ is not risen, and that Christ lies and moulders low. This is a deeply heretical thought, something which must have taken a lot of courage for the poet to articulate. And yet the poet manages to pluck that courage and manages to articulate this doubt. So this shows how deeply the writers of this time were divided on this question of how exactly to hold on to faith, how exactly to carry on believing, and how exactly to reconcile matters of belief with the more practical and logical concerns of science. We will explore more of such attempts at understanding and reconciling faith and doubt in the work of Alfred Lord Tennyson in the next lecture, which will also help us better understand the context in which writers like Christina Rossetti and George Eliot wrote their poems and novels. Thank you.